Okay, this is chapter 17 of Zodiac. Zodiac. Friday, July 27th, 1979. Since March, I had been working on breaking the large 340 symbol cipher that had defied the most sophisticated code breakers and computers at the CIA, NSA, and FBI. Zodiac's sixth letter, November 8th, 1969. That's what he's working on. Most people thought that this cipher was a joke on the part of the killer and that it had no meaning, but in the sixth line of the cipher, Zodiac had made a correction. Since he had worked so painstakingly to create an almost flawless block of symbols, it was unlikely that he would mar it by crossing out one and writing a different one if the symbol meant nothing. If Zodiac had mentioned Herb Caen, the Chronicle's famous columnist, in 1978, then it was possible that he had mentioned Cain in 1969 as well. The first three letters of the large cipher were H-E-R. I asked myself if any of the symbols in the 340-character cipher bore the same meaning as those solved by the Hardens in Zodiac's first letter. I found they did. The remaining five symbols spelled out C-E-A-N-B, combining with the H-E-R. This was an only slightly transposed version of Herb Caen. The correction that was made is right here in the sixth line, how it's crossed out and then there's, so if it means nothing, why would that happen, you know? It was only fair to figure that Zodiac had transported some of the remaining cipher as well. There were many spelling and coding mistakes in the Harden solution, and I also took this into account. Cain's name was the key word in the cipher. Using these 8 symbols as a Rosetta Stone, some of the cryptogram began to make sense. On the third line from the bottom of the cipher were the letters P-O-S-H-T/. I knew that H stood for H, and that the word could be an anagram for Takashi. Once again, I tried to imagine what Zodiac might have been like in 1969, what thoughts he might have had, and whom he might have considered his enemy. Herb Caen, for one. And I found what could be Sergeant Lace Lundbald's name in the 9th line. I think one reason the 340 symbol cipher remained unsolved for so many years is that Zodiac mentioned many of the proper names of his antagonists and places where his murders occurred. To cryptographers in the East, these names would be just so much gibberish. Slowly, the cipher began to produce words and parts of words. The word S-E-E and the incomplete word R-N space A-O-D were revealed. The last was the transposed word pardon. This gave me a symbol for P. In the 9th line, E-C-B-U was likely because. This gave me more meanings. The letter that Zodiac enclosed with the cipher was a great help. This reminded me of the formal way of speaking he adopted. His manner of being polite and vicious at the same time, and his anger at the lies the police were telling about him. He wrote of having killed 7 victims, so I looked for letter patterns that might spell 8th, referring to his next victim. He mentioned the police telling lies about him in a letter written the next day, November 9th, 1969, so I looked for the recurring word lies. He often ended his sentences with etc, so I looked for that. Zodiac had started by creating a substitution cipher, symbols substituted for alphabet characters, and then transposed these symbols, creating a substitution transposition cipher. Each alphabet character could be represented by multiple symbols. Transposition ciphers are more difficult to solve than substitution ciphers. The killer had used 65 different symbols in the cipher, with 43 of these occurring 5 times or less. Only 2, plus and B, occurred more than 10 times. Zodiac was using something very different from the cipher broken by the Hardens. If only the cipher had been a few lines longer. Experts stated that more symbols could have given a computer enough material to check all possible combinations and hand back the answer. Sunday, July 29th, 1979. I felt that I was nearing an answer. I worked every night on the code. Sometimes, when I stopped to look up at the white walls of my office, I could see the lines of the symbols in front of me. By 11 p.m., I finally thought I had the answer to one of the great unbreakable ciphers of the last decade. The Hardens had solved the three-part cipher by looking for double L combinations, the most common. I found triple L combinations, deliberate misspellings to throw off cryptanalysis. PILLL, ALLL, ALLLSO, and WILLL. In my solution, I found Zodiac had used 10 different characters for the letter E, 9 for S, and 7 for A. The recurring symbol, the backward C, turned out to stand for nothing. In the morning, I sent my solution to the cryptographers' convention then meeting at Kent State. If my answer was valid, they would know, and they might improve on any mistakes I had made. Monday, August 6, 1979. While I was working on my editorial cartoon ideas for Tuesday, my phone rang. It was Greg Mellon from the American Cryptogram Association. "Congratulations," he said, "you've broken the Zodiac code." At that moment, San Francisco was hit by the biggest earthquake it had experienced in 68 years. High-rise buildings in the downtown area began to sway, and people in my office stood up, and some left the room. "What's going on?" said the code expert. "We're having an earthquake here. People are leaving." "Do you want me to call back?" said Mellon. "No," I said. "This is more important. Go on." Just then, the city was hit by the aftershock. Mellon decided to write me the details rather than talk any longer. Wednesday, August 8th, 1979. "Dear Mr. Graysmith," Greg Mellon wrote, "as I was saying just before the earthquake, congratulations on having broken the second Zodiac cipher. Both Zodiac messages are homophonic ciphers using multiple substitutes for a single letter, with the second complicated by an added, apparently random transposition of the letters of each word. Homophonic ciphers date from at least the 15th century, 1412, and are not uncommon. The errors in spelling and in encryptment are to be expected and are written in acceptable range. I regret I can't supply you with additional clues in breaking the second message. You have abstracted all the information that is there." Eugene Waltz of the American Cryptogram Association wrote to me also. "I had an opportunity to speak with Greg Mellon at the ACA convention, and we both agreed that your solution is good and valid. We also hope that it leads to an early arrest of Zodiac. The successful solution of a cipher such as this requires intuition, good luck, and most of all, dogged perseverance to spend hour upon hour of oft-times fruitless effort to add a value or to determine the validity of values already assumed. You are to be congratulated not only for breaking the cipher, but for your willingness to spend the hours and the effort to do so." Earlier, I had turned the cipher key and solution over to the Valido PD. Here's what the cipher said. Zodiac had used a series of nulls, including a backward C and multiple I's, and the word "it" placed at random. The letter K stood for both K and S. I have left these out as well as adding punctuation and spacing so that it reads as a letter to Herb Cain, which I believe was the cipher's original purpose. Herb Cain. I give them hell to blast these lies. Sleuth should see a name below Killer's film. A pills game. Pardon me except to blast me. Bullshit. These fools shall meet Killer. Please ask Lundbald. Here, Zodiac mentions Detective Sergeant Les Lundbald, the man who had hunted him in Valido. The mention of drugs confirms police theories that Zodiac wrote the letters while he was high. Soul at HLSDUL, Clear Lake, so stare I eat a pill, asshole, I plant Mr. AH phone, Lake B. Lake B is probably a reference to Lake Berryessa, which is near Clear Lake. Mr. H.A. might refer to Chronicle columnist Art Hop. All slaves, because LSD will stolen either slave, shall I hell/Takashi, the pig stalls deals of eighth soul slain. The cipher did stir things up. After my appearance on the evening news and with the second mention of Takashi in a Zodiac letter, the San Francisco Police Department applied for a federal law enforcement assistance grant of $92,000 to go on with the case. By August 29th, the sum desired had been reduced to $70,000. Why was Zodiac killing when he did? There had been instances when a serial killer had murdered only on holidays, the 4th of July murders in Michigan, 1967 to 69. Is this what Zodiac was doing? Sherry Jo Bates was killed close to midnight on October 30th, 1966. Did the killer stand talking to her for hours waiting for midnight and the beginning of Halloween, the age-old celebrations of the dead? Zodiac attacked at Blue Rock Springs 5 minutes after midnight on the 4th of July. Kathleen Johns was taken on her terror ride in 1970 on Palm Sunday. Paul Stine was killed while San Francisco was already celebrating Columbus Day. September 27, 1969, the killing of Cecilia Shepard was the first day of the Jewish holiday Tabernacles. But the December 30th slaying of David Farday and Betty Lou Jensen fell short of Christmas. This bothered me. Zodiac's first letter was mailed November 29, 1969, only 2 days before Thanksgiving. His letters of April 1970 were postmarked the first and last days of Passover. It was an unacceptable, tenacious theory, but there was a consistency, a rhythm about the Zodiac attacks and communications that transcended holiday celebrations. Zodiac and astrology. What if the stars did control his actions? Could the unknown maniac who had been terrorizing California be following the phases of the moon? I checked October 1969 first to see if any of the phases of the moon coincided with an attack or letter. The first day of the new moon fell on October 11th, the day Paul Stine was murdered. I went on to the phases of the moon for November 1969. The first day of the new moon fell on November 9th, the day of the 340 symbol cipher was mailed to the Chronicle. The September 27, 1969 murder occurred the night of an eclipse of the moon and only 2 days after the beginning of the full moon. On July 5, 1969, killing followed by 5 days the June 29th full moon. On the day of the killing, the Earth reached a pythalon where the sun, earth, and moon were in a direct line and exert their strongest gravitational pull. Near summer solstice, this is one of the most important astrological events of the year. December 20th, 1968, the murder of Jensen and Faraday was a new moon plus 1 day and only minutes before winter solstice. Sherry Jo Bates was slain on a full moon plus 1 day, a moon known as the harvest moon. Kathleen Johns was abducted 1 day past the vernal equinox during a full moon. Zodiac's 3 letters containing the cipher, puzzle broken by the Hardens, was mailed on July 28, 1969, the first night of the full moon. In all of the killings, Saturn was visible as an evening star. In the Shepherd slaying, the moon passed above Saturn, which rose early and was in the sky most of the night in Aries. Saturn was in Aries in the July 5th murder as well as the October 11th murder. Even in the 1969 Bates murder on Halloween, which begins the age-old celebration of the dead, Saturn was the evening star. Faraday and Jensen were killed at the time of the ancient Roman festival of Saturnalia, December 17th through 23rd, when children were sacrificed to the gods. The name of Saturday is derived from Saturn's Day. Each of the victims were slain on Saturday, except for Faraday and Jensen, who were shot minutes before Saturday. When Saturn was in ascendancy, perhaps Zodiac felt he was caught in the power of the ancient god. Zodiac was writing his letters and killing at the times of consecutive lunar phases. Nowhere was this more apparent than in the choice of times he wrote to the Chronicle in 1970. The April 28th, June 26th, and July 25th letters were mailed on the first day of the last quarter phase of the moon. In 1974, when 6 occultations of Saturn occurred, and Saturn was the evening star, Zodiac broke a long silence. He wrote when Saturn was in retrograde motion and less than 1 degree south of the moon, January 29th. 2 days into the full moon, May 8th, and once again when the Earth was in Epithalon, July 8th, 4 days into the full moon. In 1978, one day after the full moon, between the time the sun entered Aries and Saturn became stationary, Zodiac wrote he was in control of all things. April 24th. Many believe that in all likelihood Zodiac was an Aries who was active in his clandestine pursuits around the full moon or new moon when Saturn is in ascendancy. However, Alex Hoyer, the astrologer, revealed in the Chronicle, the chances are the killer was born under the sign of Taurus, whose people are generally loving, kind, and gentle. Such a person, while very loving by nature, has periods of violence and rashness when thwarted and can go berserk. As an artist, I have knowledge of visual symbols. This led me to realize that the strange symbol on the Halloween card death threat really meant. It was formed by the Hebrew symbol of the Greek symbol for Taurus. And now I realize what had bothered me about the 3 circled figure 8s in the My Name Is cipher of April 20th, 1970. The tops of the 8s were not closed. They were actually 3 circled Taurus symbols. And I think that's what he means, is that. Zodiac had cleverly hidden 5 Taurus symbols in his letters. Was this his birth sign, or did he only think he was a Taurus? Whether Zodiac was a follower of astrology or only sensitive to the waxing and waning of the moon, perhaps his future actions could be predicted. He had, after all, broken a 3-year silence in a month when a major coincidence of cosmic cycles occurred in January 1974. This biological tide could have triggered an emotional explosion. Was Zodiac unconsciously being dominated by the moon, or did he plot his crimes by some sort of astrological horoscope? If he was working from a horoscope, did he draw it up himself or have it done for him? Perhaps there was an astrologer somewhere in the Bay Area who had drawn up a Taurus chart for the killer and might remember him. If Zodiac did cast a horoscope for himself, then his name was more than window dressing, and he did have a real interest in astrology. In various books on ancient languages and sciences, I have found a few of the symbols the killer used in his ciphers, but not enough to convince me Zodiac had used a particular text to form his signs. Finally, in one book, I found all of them. This book was As Above, So Below by Alan O'Key, who had created several of the symbols specifically for his horoscope book. All of the symbols Zodiac used in his 340-character cipher were the same ones used in casting a horoscope. And finally, the answer to the meaning of the Zodiac's own symbol, the crossed circle, he had killed the day before winter solstice at a Pethlon and the nearest full moon to autumnal equinox, and attacked the day after spring equinox. Winter solstice, summer solstice, autumnal equinox, and vernal equinox create a cross upon a circle. It was at these 4 points on the circle that Zodiac murdered. That's what he's talking about. Zodiac had used 2 of the 5 major symbols of astrology, the circle, spirit, overlapped by the cross, matter, to signify not only himself but the days on which he was to kill. Your information on the Oaken book is startling, Takashi wrote to me. To think that Zodiac probably used the same text that you have read is fascinating. Your thoughts that Zodiac is a follower fits into what I have been thinking for many years. I believe that you are truly on the right track, especially with the cross and circle, which, when shown visually by you, pretty much explains that you are onto something big. The common elements in the Zodiac murders had not been added to in a decade, but now that I knew what timetable the killer used, perhaps I could find links to other unsolved killings in Northern California. So I shall change the way the collecting of slaves, wrote Zodiac in 1969. I shall no longer announce to anyone when I commit my murders. They shall look like routine robberies, killings of anger, and a few fake accidents, etc. Who were the unknown victims? As I've noted, all of Zodiac's victims were young students killed in or around their cars, near bodies of water, and on weekends when the moon was new or full. Sexual molestation or robbery was not a motive. The killer used a different weapon each time. In some of the attacks, the killer carried a large flashlight. My thoughts kept going to the right side of the car, the passenger side. The only window down at Lake Herman Road was on the right, where Betty Lou was sitting. Magoo's window at Blue Rock Springs was down, and Stein's fly window was open on the passenger side. Zodiac went to some difficulty to pull Stein to the passenger side of the cab. At Lake Herman Road, the killer fired a shot in the rear window and, moving around the station wagon, fired another bullet in the left rear wheel housing to successfully force the couple to leap from the passenger side. Did Zodiac associate the passenger side with hitchhikers? Were these his other victims? If Zodiac was positioning bodies in a ritual way, the most common posture was one of the victims hanging part or all the way out of the right passenger side of the car, on his back, palms up, with his head pointing away from the car. Even Magoo, after he fell from Darlene's car, accidentally adopted this posture. David Faraday and Paul Stein, both victims of bullets near the car, were on their backs. David's head pointed to the east and Paul's to the north. The one thing that had never ceased to puzzle me was how Zodiac knew, on pitch-black Lake Herman Road, that the girl was on her right side, feet to the west, that in the dark Blue Rock Springs lot Darlene was wearing padded slacks, and that he had shot Magoo in the knee while the boy was thrashing about with his legs. If Zodiac knew such details, could they have been observed during a rushed killing after which he had only moments to get away? He must have followed the victim earlier in the evening. It was a good possibility because he attacked his victims almost immediately after they parked. If he knew the areas so well, was he a Vallejo resident, or someone who had access to the coroner's and police reports? The missing Lake Tahoe nurse, Donna Lass, last seen alive just before the autumnal equinox, has never been found and is considered a possible Zodiac victim. Judith Ann Hierarchy, also a nurse, was found April 26, 1970, in a shallow grave in remote Placer County, but this was 13 days before the vernal equinox. Nancy Ballendeck, a court reporter, was found dead in her apartment October 26, 1970. The next day, the Chronicle received a letter from Zodiac claiming 14 victims. Police felt that if Zodiac did in fact kill Donna Lass at Lake Tahoe, he might be responsible for the deaths of the other two women. Marie Antoinette Ansley was abducted from the Colorado Inn in Vallejo, where Darlene Ferrin used to go dancing. This was 7 days before the vernal equinox on Friday, March 30th, 1970. 1 year to the day she disappeared, Zodiac mailed the Chronicle a letter. 1 year to the day that her body was discovered, March 21st, 1971, Zodiac mailed the Chronicle a postcard. The next Friday, the 13th, in 1970, came in November. It was on this night that a car pulled off Ascot Avenue and drove 30 feet into a field on the northern edge of Sacramento, dragging a body through the weeds and throwing it face up next to a wire fence. The victim's throat was then cut. So badly beaten was the woman that dental charts were necessary to establish her identity. She was another nurse, Santa Rosa resident Carol Beth Hilburn, who had once studied to be an X-ray technician at Sutter General Hospital in Sacramento. The strawberry blonde had been estranged from her husband for 3 months and was staying with her sister in Santa Rosa. A mysterious girl known only as Dee accompanied Carol to Sacramento on Thursday, November 12th, to see some friends who were members of local motorcycle gangs, motorcycle types, and the wrong people, as her husband called them. Dee dropped Carol off at an after-hours club on West Capitol Avenue frequented by motorcycle gangs. Carol was wearing a hip-length black jacket with Santa Rosa printed on the front in yellow letters. She had gone to the bar to keep a date with a boyfriend and was still at the bar at 4 a.m. After that, she was not seen again. When her body was found the next day, she was wearing only one of her suede boots and on the other foot a single ped. Her panties had been pulled down around one knee. Was her killer keeping her clothes and purse? The name of the after-hours club was the Zodiac. The third Friday, the 13th victim, July 1973, was Nancy Patricia Gildley, who was abducted from her motel in San Francisco and dumped in the parking lot of Washington High School. All of her clothes had been taken. Stein, the cab driver, had been killed on Washington Street. Cosette Ellison was killed 17 days before the vernal equinox, and Patricia King 15 days before. Eva Ballou was killed on the vernal equinox. All died in 1970. All were found tossed in ravines. In 1969, Lena Roberts had been killed 10 days before the winter solstice. Police believe that one man killed all of these women. On July 6, 1979, a corpse with hands and ankles bound to its neck with clothesline was found in a shallow grave near Calistoga Road in Santa Rosa. This discovery rekindled speculation about 7 unsolved murders dating back to 1972. The 7 were Maureen L. Sterling, 12, and Giovanna L. Weber, 12, who vanished on their way home from the Redwood Ice Skating Rink in Santa Rosa at 4 p.m. Friday, February 4th, 1972. Their skeletons were discovered down a 60-foot embankment off a rural road in the Franz Valley area of East Sonoma County. They had been murdered elsewhere and dumped where they were found on December 28, 1972. The killer had kept their clothes and had also taken 1 gold earring from each girl. Kim Wendy Allen, 19, a Santa Rosa junior college student, vanished while hitchhiking to her residence in Santa Rosa on March 4, 1972. She had come from her job at the Lakespur Health Food Store and was seen hitchhiking north on 101 around 5 p.m. It was a Saturday and 16 days before the vernal equinox. Her nude body was found in a creek bed 20 feet from Enterprise Road. She had been strangled with white clothesline. Her wrists and ankles showed marks of having been bound as she had been spread eagle. She had superficial cuts on her chest. 1 of her gold earrings had been taken, as well as her clothes and possessions. I obtained a list of what Kim Allen had been seen carrying when she left work. 1 was a straw carrying bag 24 inches high with straw handles filled with health food. The second object was a wooden barrel 2.5 feet tall, empty, with the word soy printed on the side in black ink. The soy sauce barrel also had some Chinese writing printed on it. The killer kept the barrel. And now I thought I knew where the killer had gotten the symbol at the bottom of the exorcist letter from. I got 1 of the barrels and found this particular Zodiac symbol matched some of the Chinese characters closely. That's the Zodiac symbol, and that's the Chinese symbol on the bottle. Lori Lee Cursat, 13, was last seen alive in the You Save Market in Santa Rosa on November 21, 1972. Her nude body was found on December 12, 1972, with a broken neck. Her first and second cervical vertebrae had been dislocated. She had 2 wire loops in her pierced ears, no earrings attached. Carolyn Nadine Davis, 15, a runaway from Anderson in Shasta County, was last seen leaving her grandmother's house in Garberville on July 15th, hitchhiking south on 101. Her nude body was discovered 2.2 miles north of Porter Creek Road on Franz Valley Road in the exact spot as Sterling and Weber. She was found July 31st, 1973. The police discovered that Carolyn had bought a one-way ticket to fly from Redding to San Francisco. She had been poisoned by sturricine. Therese Diane Walsh, 33, disappeared exactly on the winter solstice 1973, hitchhiking on 101 from Malibu Beach to her home in Gaberville. Her body was discovered near the spot where Kim Wendy Allen's was found. She had been hog-tied with a 1/4 inch nylon rope, strangled, and thrown into a creek. She had been sexually assaulted. Jeanette Camahel, 20, was the victim found on July 6, 1979. A Santa Rosa junior college student, she was last seen hitchhiking near the Cotati on-ramp of Highway 101 and was traveling north to Santa Rosa on April 25, 1972. Her body was discovered in a Sonoma County ravine in a shallow grave near Calistoga Road. The co-ed had been tied with her hands and ankles bound to her neck. White clothesline was wrapped around her neck 4 times. She was found 100 yards from the spot where Lori Lee Kearse's body was discovered. There were other possible Zodiac victims that my research uncovered. Betty Closer, 21, was killed 2 days before the summer solstice in 1971. In the year 1972, Linda Oling, 19, was murdered 6 days after the vernal equinox, and Alexander Clary, 24, was killed 18 days before the autumnal equinox. Susan McLaughlin, 19, was murdered 18 days before the vernal equinox, and Yovine Quillatang, 15, 11 days before the summer solstice in 1973. 19 days prior to the winter solstice, both Kathy Fetchel, 27, and Michael Shane, 30, were killed and dumped off a Livermore highway. 6 days after autumnal equinox in 1974, Donna Marie Braun, 14, was murdered. On Thursday, October 16, 1975, Susan Dye was strangled while she was hitchhiking home. She was discovered under a freeway overpass near Santa Rosa. Almost all were hitchhikers, some with minor involvement in drugs. Any hitchhiker would accompany the passenger seat, Zodiac's usual focus of attack. The killer had a knowledge of knot tying consistent with a seaman. The victims were found near areas of water, as most Zodiac victims had been. Walsh in a creek, Roberts in Balones Lagoon. Ansley was drowned, Dudley on the bank of Lake Merced, and Braun floating in the Salinas River. Few had been sexually molested. None of the clothing of the nude victims has ever been found. The killer struck over weekends at dusk or night and bound his victims in Santa Rosa, while white clothesline of the type used on the victims at Lake Berryessa. 3 of the girls had it wrapped around their necks. All of the victims were killed away from where they were found. When the murderer dumped the bodies, he parked his car in the road and not on the shoulder so that he would not leave tracks. The victims had been lifted and tossed over drainage ditches and fences and down hillsides, indicating he was an extremely strong man. The killer knew the area. The students were tortured, stabbed, poisoned, strangled, drowned, smothered, or broken. Since the bodies were being dumped in the same spots, layered, with mouths separating each dumping, the police were convinced that the same person was committing all or most of these killings. The truly horrifying part to me was that it seemed that someone was experimenting in different ways of killing people. CI&I, as of July 1974, had 103 murder cases that had the above characteristics, including cases in Washington and Oregon. They were certain at the least 14 of them involved the same man. My source is a special report, Unsolved Female Homicides, an analysis of a series of related murders in California and Western America, marked confidential and printed February 1975 by the Department of Justice, California. From the Office of the Attorney General, a secret report was issued stating that over the past 5 years, 1969 to 74, there have been 14 young women murdered in Northern California, and all of these murders appear to have been committed by the same person. 8 other women have mysteriously disappeared in the states of Oregon and Washington over the past year. The report, developed by the California Department of Justice with the aid of many local law enforcement agencies, stated that they thought the killer was familiar with witchcraft or the occult because of a witchcraft symbol found during the Carolina Davis case and the possible occult involvement in the missing female cases in the states of Oregon and Washington. The report concluded the murders will probably continue until such time as the perpetrator is identified and apprehended. Were these the missing Zodiac victims? Santa Rosa came up over and over. They were either students at Santa Rosa Junior College or Santa Rosa residents killed elsewhere. Was there a Zodiac suspect who had links to Santa Rosa? When I asked Takashi if there was a major Zodiac suspect who had ties to Santa Rosa, he said, yes, there was, but that's all I can say until the case is closed. And then there was a suspect I had yet to find. Other investigators were also evasive. What were they looking for? Meanwhile, I continued looking for Don Andrews. Friday, February 29th, 1980. I felt that to the people around him, the Zodiac killer might well appear to be a well-controlled man, calm, reasonable, a loner with few contacts with others. He was, however, wrapped up in a dream world of movies, fantasy, and melodrama. This was the part of his personality that carried over into his dark side. In a secret evaluation of the murders of Sherry Jo Bates, written in July 1967 for the Riverside District Attorney's Office by the chief psychologist of Patton State Hospital, the girl's killer is described as so hypersensitive that virtually any misperceived act could be blown up out of proportion to the facts. He is obsessed and pathologically preoccupied with intense hatred against female figures, all the more so if he sees the young woman as attractive. Because of his own unconscious feelings of inadequacy, he is not likely to act out his feelings sexually, but in fantasy as a rule. The fantasy can take on aggressive aspects, as in the case of the Bates girl's murder. At the end of the report is this warning. I would like to emphasize that there is a real possibility that he can become homicidal again. Friday, February 29th, 1980. I was sitting across from one of the nation's leading experts on mass murder, Dr. Donald T. Lund, clinical professor of psychiatry and lecturer in law at Stanford University. The young-looking, light-haired doctor was currently examining Kenneth Bianchi in connection with the Hillside Strangler trial. I had seen him several times on TV. We met in Lund's fashionable, book-lined office on the second floor of the Stanford Law School. Dr. Lund, you say there are two distinct types of mass killers, sexual sadist, and the more common, the paranoid schizophrenic. A paranoid schizophrenic is controlled by external forces such as voices telling him what to do and often kills women because of confused sexual identity. He suffers from disordered thinking, hallucinations, persecution, and delusions of grandiosity. Contributing factors are environment and heredity or the taking of drugs such as LSD or PCP. If the paranoid schizophrenic reaches his mid-30s, the range may burn itself out or go into remission. Having seen copies of all the Zodiac letters, are you inclined to believe that Zodiac is a sexual sadist? I asked. Most likely, if I had to make a choice, it would be that, said Lund. Unlike the paranoid schizophrenic, the sadistic sociopathic killer does not suffer from hallucinations but selects his victims for the purpose of venting certain deeply rooted sexual and sadistic urges, such as the need to mutilate parts of the victim's body to achieve sexual satisfaction. I had the impression that there were more of these people around than 10-20 years ago. When I saw Edmund Emil Kemper, who killed 8 women in Santa Cruz, killing his mother last, I went back through the literature and found very few cases, one every decade. So I thought it was just a rare event and I probably would never see another person like that again. In the last year, I alone have seen several, and it's amazing the characteristics that they have in common. It seems there were very few sexual sadists reported in the 20th century, but the 70s, just full of them. Now that I've been able to personally study several of these people, there are an awful lot of similarities. Kenneth A. Bianchi confessed to 5 killings in the L.A. Hillside Strangler killings. Bianchi's responses on pathological tests were almost verbatim like Kemper's. The whole sort of thing of seeing animals torn apart in blood and animal hearts. A psychological profile of a sexual sadist, and most likely of Zodiac, would read like this. He is always male, usually under 35, clever, stealthy, strong, and intelligent. He has a passive, cruel, or estranged father and a seductive, dominant mother who gives affection and rejection erratically. The sexual sadist seeks revenge toward his mother, fantasizes her death, but is perversely in love with her. Sex with other women is impossible. In most cases, he has few social or sexual affiliations and has never had an experience of normal sexual intercourse. Murder is the only successful relationship he can have with a woman. All of his victims are only substitutes for his true target, his mother, who is often the last victim. He has a past history of animal torture in his early teens. Richard Trenton Case, the Sacramento vampire killer, for example, drank human blood and kept animal kidneys and livers in his freezer. He strangles and poisons his pets as substitutes for human victims. For reasons unknown, sexual and aggressive impulsives intertwine easily in childhood in these sadistic types and eventually find expression in vicious sexual assaults and sadistic murders. He kills to achieve sexual pleasure. Murder produces a powerful sexual arousal and pleasure and is a replacement for sex. He may masturbate while reliving the crimes. The sexual sadist often taunts the police in letters, uses deliberate misspellings, and under stress may use handwriting that is unrecognizable from his true writing. The pleasure of baiting the police may actually become the motive for the slayings, and though he takes great pains to appear normal and avoid capture, he often throws suspicion upon himself. The sexual sadist has a long self-mutilating drive. As a child, he may play at his own execution and eventually become suicidal. He will be fascinated with the tools of police work and with policemen and may pretend to be one. He collects weapons and instruments of torture and has great skill in their use. The sadist seeks the dehumanization of his victims into objects that cannot reject him and that he has power over. He is incurable, feels no remorse for the cruelty he inflicts on others, and will most likely repeat his crimes. He chooses victims with specific characteristics, such as students or hitchhikers. The sexual sadist can describe his assaults in great detail. If caught for one murder, he takes delight in confessing to all the others in an effort to dismay the police. The sexual sadist may be clever enough not to have a history of identifiable mental illness. Why are there so many around now? I asked. A possible explanation is that these people were perceived by parents as weird because they did things like cutting up animals and putting the parts in the refrigerator or whatever, said Lund. And under the old laws, that was enough to get someone committed, but now it isn't. I suspect there were a bunch of people put away for life who were potential Zodiac-type killers. But now that you can't keep people out longer than 90 days, people like that are just getting out. The Lanterman-Petrus Shore Act was passed in 1967 and determined that a person can be detained only if he is a danger to himself or others. The reduction of 50,000 psychiatric beds in California in 1960 to 5,000 today deposited patients in local communities ill-prepared to handle them. Until 1969, for instance, people could be committed for life to a mental hospital on pretty flimsy grounds. There was this drastic change where it became very difficult to commit someone. You had to have concrete evidence of either suicidal acts or an act of violence toward others. How often, I asked, have you personally seen a sexual sadist? How many have you talked with? 12, Len replied, which is a lot more than one. But it doesn't, on the other hand, compared to the thousands of paranoid schizophrenics. There's something spooky about the incredible similarities among sexual sadists. Is it inconsistent, I asked, for sexual sadists to be a child molester as well? No, the thing about all these people and the one thing they have in common is an abnormal relationship with women. They are limited or incapable of forming normal adult sexual relationships. And so, what are the alternatives? One is sex with dead bodies or killing for sexual satisfaction. Another is sex with children. There are the common threads of inadequate, normal adult sexual relationships and also the need to have power over the sexual object, which you can achieve either through violence and strangulation, tying up or whatever, or with children. The common thing is the power relationship and the need to be all-powerful vis-a-vis the sexual object. I remember what Kemper, the archetypal sexual sadist, said of his murders at his trial. It was kind of a triumphant type thing, like taking the head off a deer or an elk or something would be to a hunter. I was the hunter and they were my victims. Sunday, March 2nd, 1980. Because of the Zodiac's gigantic ego, I had always felt that somewhere along the line he would have to write Takashi using his real name. I asked the inspector if he ever received a letter from any of the Zodiac suspects. Well, there is one, he said, a Valito student named Star, not his real name. As I recall, the phrasing was, "If I can ever be of any help to you, just let me know. I'm sorry I wasn't your man." After the April 1978 Zodiac letter surfaced, a guy named Jim Silver with the California Department of Justice told me, "You know, Starr is out of prison and he's been out for about 6 months. And you got this new letter and it's been authenticated." I told him, "Yeah, I know. I got a letter from Starr about 6 months ago. He wrote me to let me know he was out, and I thought at the time it was unusual." "Jesus Christ," said Silver. "He's weird. He's a weird son of a bitch. He's such a good suspect. We've got to watch him all the time." I asked Takashi how the letter was addressed. "Well, it was addressed only to me, not to Armstrong. It was addressed to me by my full name, Inspector David Takashi." "I bet he typed it." "That's right, Robert. It was typed," said Takashi. Monday, March 3rd, 1980. I had the day off from work to speak with Lieutenant Hustad of the Villito PD. I had a hunch that Starr was the Santa Rosa link, and I was going to see if Hustad could verify it. Hustad came in late, dressed in rough Western clothes with an outside holster. As usual, he was tanned and fit. Hustad, in an off-hours job, ran the Stress Management Hypnosis Institute on Marin Street. He was an expert in hypnosis. He worked for the state in some trials. After putting witnesses in a trance in a soundproof room, he would record their testimony on his built-in closed-circuit TV system. It was Hustad's idea that we were flying in Kathleen Johns, the woman who had escaped from Zodiac with her daughter, and have her put under deep hypnosis to enable her to describe the man that she believed to be Zodiac. But the police had been unable to find her. Hustad was glad I had brought him information about Don Andrews, Narlo's favorite suspect. Otherwise, Robert, we could not morally search for the Napa suspect without stepping on Narlo's toes. I'm glad you came up with the information on your own. I'm interested in his whereabouts. Do you know where Andrews is now?" "He's somewhere in San Francisco now," I said, "but to be honest, I've begun to have my doubts about him. The witnesses at the Stein killing say that he is too old and too fat." Then I asked Hustad about Starr, the suspect who had written to Takashi. "This Starr really has my interest," I told him. "I get strong feelings from the letter he wrote Takashi." "I know what you mean," said Hustad. "He's always been my favorite." The rest of the day we talked about Starr, who was no longer a student but had moved in 1971 to Santa Rosa, where he was a salesman. His mother bought a house there in August 1975. And that night I began to put together a report on the best Zodiac suspect I had found yet.